Thank you. Hey, everyone. Welcome to our program today. I know a couple of you that are out there, but just the same, my name is Tom Borg, along with my colleague Adam Owens. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar, Tapping the Emotional Quotient Potential of Your Leadership Team. Now, our presenter today is somebody special. He's my colleague and friend, Ron Altmans. Ron is the founder of Lead Skill, a consulting firm that develops leaders and teams in growing companies. Ron has more than 25 years experience in consulting and education, much of that time spent in coaching and training business people. Ron works best with challengers, smaller companies growing and taking to the larger firms or taking on the larger firms in the status quo. Ron was born in Venezuela, speaks multiple languages, grew up in the US. He lived and worked for 8 years in Asia. In the US and Asia, he has experience and perspective on what makes people successful and what gets in their way. So please help me welcome Mr. Ron Altmans. Ron, take it over.
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate
Welcome.
that. It's very energetic. Welcome. So Tom is joining us from Michigan, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, Michigander. And I have been to just about every corner of the US and other parts of the world too. So I welcome people here. Some of you I know and others are new friends. And so Cole, I noticed that you mentioned in the chat that you're moving from Houston, from my neck of the woods over to North Carolina. So you've got exciting things coming up. And Jill, welcome from San Diego.
Yes, thank you.
Great to have everyone here. So I'm going to share my screen here, and we're going to get started looking at the presentation about EQ in your leadership team. And I don't have tons of slides here, but I want to move through these and help us to just look at 3 key points, really. And I think probably this quote from Daniel Goleman is a good way to set the stage. Goleman, of course, is the guy who popularized emotional intelligence in the 1990s with the landmark book. 2 books, in fact, Emotional Intelligence and Working with Emotional Intelligence. And he said, a view of human nature that ignores the power of emotions is sadly short-sighted. And all you have to do is look at the field of leadership. And, you know, leaders around us, the ones that are really effective are often not the ones that are the biggest celebrities. They're the ones that we sometimes take for granted, and they're often the quiet leaders and the humble leaders, I would say. And I think emotional intelligence is one of the underrated difference makers when it comes to leadership and actually business performance. So let me just share with you my fairly simple definition of emotional intelligence, what it is, and then I'm going to just briefly touch on some of the components. So I say emotional intelligence is being aware of and able to manage emotions, both in yourself and working with other people. And so when you think about that, it actually gives you a 2x2 grid. And management consultants, we love 2x2 grids, right? So self and others, managing yourself, which is, you know, self-regulation, and being aware of yourself. So awareness and control or management. So managing myself, being aware of myself, being aware of others, which I call empathy, and managing others, which we could call it leadership or influence. I think both of those are different aspects of how to be effective with people. The last thing that you want to do, though, is try to boss people. That's not the way to be effective or emotionally intelligent with the people you lead. And I think that's probably one of the shortcomings and one of the sure signs that I see often in organizations of a lack of emotional intelligence is people who are trying to lead as a boss instead of lead as a facilitator, as a coach, as someone who is inspiring the team instead of trying to command them. 5 dimensions of EQ. Let me just speak to these very quickly, touch on them. What I just mentioned, kind of the 2x2 is helpful. One thing it leaves out, though, is in the middle, besides self-awareness and self-regulation, is motivation, about moving yourself ahead and persevering until you get through with the task, through to the goal, through to the vision that you are trying to accomplish. And then social awareness, empathy, social regulation. Those are the 5 components of EQ. And by the way, if you've got questions as we're going through this, would love to invite you to put those into the chat, and we will take time for questions in the second half. And when I say second half, I mean, I'm going to be done in like 10 minutes, and then we're going to open it up and have that conversation. So I welcome your questions. One of the things that often comes up when I'm speaking to leaders is the whole question of, can we really measure EQ? Let me just, is this too large? Let me make that a little bit, size it a little bit differently. The short answer is yes, we can measure EQ, and there's different ways to do that. So one way is with an EQ assessment. So we can definitely measure people, just having them fill out a survey and asking questions of them so that we can get a more objective reading about how well they rate on these different dimensions, things like motivation and social awareness. And you can see a page from an EQ report here. EQ is definitely measurable. There's other ways to measure it too. So besides a self-assessment, there's also something like 360 feedback, where you can get other people to rate someone on their EQ. There's also rough and ready ways to do this, like, just taking a quiz. I've put one up on YouTube, and I've had, 30,000 people or so take that, and given feedback and just kind of sharing, like, man, just answering a few questions, I can get a rough and ready read of my own personal EQ. Now, it's not scientifically valid, and so we need to up our game. And I think organizations expect something that's a little more robust and objective. And so you need to have a tool that is that's been validated, that really passes muster, and you can defend it. The second part about EQ being measurable is, okay, great. So what if I measure it, but if it's a fixed sort of thing, what can we do with it? That's where EQ is different from IQ. EQ is trainable, meaning we can learn it. It's a learnable skill. It's something that we can grow in and develop. And so there are definite ways to increase and to grow in our EQ over time. So let me just tell you, I'm learning and I'm growing in the use of EQ. One of the places for myself, my own personal edge, is working on self-awareness more and more. Even yesterday, I was working, not just in self-awareness, but taking it an edge further, like my own self-regulation. And I recorded a video about this that hasn't gone up yet on YouTube, but we're going to post it probably in the next week or so. But I was just talking about, in my interactions with other people, and specifically on this call, Angela, she knows this. She came into my office. She was interrupting, something I was doing. I was, heads down, trying to get some work done. And she was interrupting me, but it was a good interruption because we definitely needed to get something out on time. But in the midst of that interaction, and she was trying to get me, hey, make sure you look this over, tell me if we're good to go, and then, just hit send. She left the office, and then she turned around and came back and said, hey, you know what? You're not really showing much appreciation here. And I don't appreciate that, because I'm working hard here and I'm trying to help you be successful, but you leave me feeling deflated. And I was like, man, I mean, she was right. And previous Ron would have argued and defended myself, like why I was totally justified to be the way I was, the interruption and all that. But I caught myself in the moment, just like, okay. Okay. And then I had to clean it up. And so this thing about EQ, it's an ongoing process. It's something that we learn and that we're training and that we are being coached on. And it's really working the edge of leadership. So I find that leaders who think that they're all good or that they are very highly self-aware are some of the biggest challenges. A leader who is somewhat aware that they don't have it all figured out and are open to contribution, open to feedback, are the ones who make the best progress. And so it's a big challenge. How do we get leaders on the page of seeing why we need to pay attention to EQ? I'm going to pass over this. I just want to make the point there are a lot of EQ tools available to us for both training and an ongoing daily basis. Trackers, emotion wheels, all sorts of nifty like training hacks and things that will really help you. So find a good coach or trainer who can help you grow in EQ if that's an area that you're trying to develop. Besides EQ being measurable, I think the second thing is making a business case for EQ. Like, it's not just a nice thing to learn, it's an essential thing to learn. And what I've got on this slide for us to consider is, if you start at the top, what is everyone wanting in a business? They want good performance, great performance maybe, and value add. Are we making a profit? Are we making a difference here? And that ultimately is going to be judged by the customers. Whether customers come in the first place, whether customers stick around, stay with us, and whether we grow the customer base. So the customer experience is key. Well, I'll tell you what, EQ is essential at each level of this graphic. At the level of performance, at the level of customer interactions and whether customers feel valued, whether the customer experience is positive, the CX. Well, who touches our customers? Our employees. And the culture of our companies and the EQ of our leaders is what drives employee culture. So if you just think about at every level, it starts with the leaders, but instead of putting the leaders at the top of the diagram, they're at the bottom, because they are supporting all of this. And the EQ of our leaders, if it's growing, it doesn't even have to be out, stellar. It doesn't have to be out of the park. If a leader will simply acknowledge that they don't have the best EQ, but they're working on it, it already starts shifting and shaping the culture in a positive way, in a better way than whatever it is when it starts out. And with a better employee culture, we take care of customers better. And if our customers are sticking around, the business profits and the performance and the value of the business grows over time. So to me, that's the simple way of just making the business case for EQ. And I hope that you can see that each one of these is really essential, and EQ comes into the mix. You may say, well, Ron, tell me about customer experience. Well, how many times do customers interact with our company and they find someone who doesn't have a high EQ, or someone who's just been chewed out by the boss and is kind of sour in their interaction with a customer? What about our marketing? How we even try to attract customers in the first place. If we don't have empathy in our marketing, it's going to be off. It's going to lack resonance. Our marketing department, our sales department need EQ. So I could probably make a whole presentation on just this, but I'll leave that aside and I'll say there's clearly a business case to be made for using EQ. The third thing that I'm going to mention here is, what about the leadership impact? What happens with our leaders? How do we maximize the leadership impact of emotional intelligence? Some of this ties into the previous slide on the business case. If you have a higher EQ, your employees are going to be more engaged. I mean, who likes working for a boss who's not really got much self-awareness? I started working with a coaching client 2 months ago, And it was interesting. He came on one of our first calls saying, Ron, I have a pretty high EQ. And I'm always a little bit cautious when I hear that, but I was like, okay, tell me more about that. And he was saying, yeah, I probably have the highest EQ of, the executive team. And he was a senior member of the team. He's a more junior member. And I said, tell me more. And so he was kind of, going through this. And I said, great. I'm actually going to interview your boss and your boss's boss. And I'm going to find out, more about this. And I finished those interviews just a week ago. And I had to agree with him in the end. He probably is the highest EQ of the executive team. And the very fact that this guy who's in a remote location, not really on a daily basis, working with the senior leadership team, has given him a little bit of autonomy. But the fact that his boss invested in him and said, you know what, you want leadership coaching? Go for it. We'll stand behind you. And the fact that this guy already has some amount of EQ, but is trying to grow it further, really speaks to the fact that he is engaging with his employees and also with his boss. He's managing up and also managing down. And with his growing self-awareness, that's just is making his operation run even better than what it was. I'll say second of all, as far as leadership impact of EQ, we make better business decisions with EQ. We're less impulsive. We're less biased. We also get feedback from more people, and we have better inputs to the decision-making process. That's what I see among leaders who are rigorous in practicing emotional intelligence. And so the third impact is, this is the time of year when plans for 2023 are pretty much getting baked in, and people have been doing their strategic planning, or they should have been by now. So strategy is key. Execution and what we do with our strategy, and then how that filters through to our talent. And I know a lot of companies right now are kind of looking at the possibility of, hey, we're slipping into recession, or we're seeing a slowdown in business. You see the big tech companies shedding jobs, by the thousands right now. And that's kind of a sign of, what's ahead. And so a lot of companies are being more careful about their spending, or freezing investment and spending right now. But what I'm noticing is, among some of my base, the challengers, the small companies who are taking on bigger firms, the Goliaths, the status quo, the corporates, they're actually doubling down and investing in this time, because they say, we need people who are not just good thinkers, but they also are empathetic. They're good feelers. We need people who are not just good at follow-up, but they're also good at feedback. We need people who plan, but they also perform. It's not an either or, it's a both and. It's not just strategy or execution, it's strategy and execution. And I find that high EQ leaders actually get this and practice this better than leaders who don't have as great a self-awareness as they think they do. So I'm going to just stop that and say, these are some of the things I'm noticing about tapping the EQ potential of your leadership team. I hope I've given you some insights, or at least some thought points to grab hold of. I'm going to turn this over to Adam right now, and then we're going to have questions. So I hope you're ready to fire away. Adam?
Yeah, thank you, Ron. And a lot of great insights and perspectives in there. I really appreciate you taking the time to coalesce your thoughts around EQ and its applications in the workplace. I'd like to start off by saying this is going to be one in a series of webinars that Ron, Angela, Tom, and I are facilitating, leading up to a 2-day web conference in March, on March 8th and 9th. So if you have the 8th and 9th free on your calendar, go ahead and put a bookmark in there. We'll be getting out the registration for that web conference later. But our next event in the series is going to be at the same time of day as this one, on November 30th. So also bookmark that as well. And we're going to be talking about engagement and expectations, and where the twain meet in your business model, how to get the most out of matching them as well. Now, the conference on March 8th and 9th is going to be primarily looking at applications for people sciences, right? So what are the business applications for emotional intelligence assessments, for engagement assessments, for personality sciences, and a variety of other things that we're going to be diving into. If you have questions in the meantime, particular to emotional intelligence, I would absolutely recommend that you reach out to Ron directly. Ron, if you could drop your communication information, maybe an email or phone, in the chat, that way people have it if they want to reach out to you. If you currently have a consultant that you work with on assessments, obviously feel free to reach out to them directly first. You can get help either of those two ways. So I do have some questions for you, Ron, about the stuff you talked about today. But before I dive in, I wanted to open it up to those folks on the call. So is there anyone on the call right now who has a particular question about EQ that they would like to put to Ron so he can get it answered for you? Feel free to come off of mute and ask, or type it in the chat.
Right. I have a question. I really like the idea of thinking of maximizing the impact that a leader or any person could have by deliberately thinking about EQ and leading others into it. I'd like to hear more about how to measure it besides just the assessment. And then what was the assessment it was WIS or WISC or something? What was that assessment you said after you said EQ 360 and then, I don't know, Cheese Whiz or something?
Yes.
EQ
That's
in
great,
the
Jill.
can, right?
So, I mean, there are different EQ tools out there. And what I mentioned was that one quiz that, you can do free. I've got one on my Lead Skill channel on YouTube. I mean, it's like a 2.5-minute video that I put where I put 10 questions. These are actually pretty good questions that have been, I've used them a lot in organizations, but I've had like over 200 people give comments and actually score themselves online and put comments in public about how they scored on my EQ quiz. So if people say, Ron, I need a cheap solution, it's like I have no money to spend, it's like, go on YouTube and just type in EQ assessment. I think my video comes up number 1 or number 2, and you can find like a free quiz. So it wasn't Cheese Whiz, it was free quiz. But thanks, Jill. No claims about it being like scientifically validated, but I think the questions are solid. The tool that I use is with TTI, and it's called EQ3. And a more robust version of that is something called Trimetrics EQ, which actually combines the EQ3 assessment with DISC and with something else called driving forces, and you get a holistic view of a person. That's pretty scientifically, validated. It's really strong. Other ways to make it measurable, I would say, besides a 360 like formalized, I've actually encouraged companies to start putting this into their quarterly planning and review process, Jill, where when we look at their key metrics or KPIs, if they have them, key performance indicators of the business, I ask them to add a weighting about how are we growing in EQ, and it needs to be specific to the department. For example, in operations, they need to think about like how EQ is most directly impacting operations. I think one of the ways is conscientiousness and awareness. It's like, are we growing in our situational awareness and safety practices? That's operational. That's something very, in the weeds, but I found like in a manufacturing environment, it's very practical and doable. In an office environment, it has more to do with communication and how well we're practicing feedback with one another. And I find that whenever people actually, and this has been shown, in psychological studies too, when people rate others, they tend to be more objective than when they rate themselves. And if you get people doing what I call pulse surveys of one another in an office environment, together people can kind of measure how they're doing and how they're improving on EQ and where their gaps are. I'd say a final way to sort of measure this and put it into the everyday working of the business is requiring leaders to actually give themselves a self-score, but also submit to anonymous feedback. And I call these mini 360s. They're not like a formalized process, but mini 360s from their team that have no more than 5 questions. 3 questions is even better, because when I find when you limit the scope of the feedback and you just get on like, very granular, just 3 items or 4, 5 at the most, that people can get more specific. And if they know it's anonymous and there's no like kickback, then they tend to open up more and we can talk about it and make it discussable. But it's a great question about, there's a lot of ways to make things measurable without needing to get too elaborate.
Yeah, no, thanks. You really triggered an idea I hadn't thought of before, but we do have clients who do these pulse series, pulse surveys,
Yes.
especially for physicians. We do quite a bit of work with physicians. And
a lot of companies have that. Yeah.
And I've never thought, they often don't share it, but if we put it in the context of the overall coaching, trimetrics, things we work with them on, I think it would be a great idea to come back to the EQ and put it to their own personal map on Pulse. Not just the global group map, but their own they get a personal pulse evaluation. So thanks for that. Thanks for clarifying that. These are excellent. And I will go on and try the test without the cheese. And look at your YouTube. And I'll think more about it. That was helpful. Thank you.
Good. You're
That's
welcome.
Awesome. Excellent question, Jill. And thanks again for the thoughtful response, Ron. I really like too that you mentioned several times in the presentation and then also in your answer there, how a lot of these different things that we can look at from the angle of assessments are linked to each other, right? So leadership impact, there's obviously a lot of other angles on that besides EQ, and they're all interlocked with each other. So whether you're using a formal assessment or not, it's primarily useful and important for you to ask some questions about EQ. Start somewhere, right? Make sure you're considering it at least a bit. And then if you need something more formal, there's lots of good options out there. Also very beneficial to have a third party come in and help add outside perspective to where you might need formal assessments and where you might be able to get away with something less formal, less cost and time intensive. So big benefits there for having a third party assist you with finding the biggest wins for your organization. We're out of time for today, so thank you everybody for participating. Yeah, it's time flies when you're having fun. Smarter hurts, right? Ron, it looks like you've got something to say. Did you want to have a last word in?
I was just noticing the question in the comments, so I would ask for maybe 1 minute to go over here. The question is, how can you use EQ for assessing a person's potential for leadership? And my quick answer is, I tend to take a generous view that there's a lot more potential for leadership in more people than we often give opportunity or credit to. And so the way I use EQ for people's leadership potential is I'm much more interested to see how much self-awareness people have and how much they are open to feedback and whether they are ready to put the work in. And so it's less about trying to find people who've got what I'd say just absolutely high scores on any kind of an assessment. And it's more of the dialogue. So it's kind of like whenever we have a conversation, I won't call it an interview, because I think in interviews, people often are kind of putting the best face forward, and there's a certain amount of performance involved. We're trying to perform up to a standard. But when we can have a conversation about, hey, tell me where you see yourself in terms of leadership. And it's often the people who kind of don't give themselves quite enough credit that I actually see the greatest potential. The folks who are very promotional of themselves, I'm already in my mind kind of calculating a discount and saying, ooh, need to watch out here. Because although someone who's very confident of themselves will often be like the hare, and I'm talking about in the race between the turtle and the hare, the tortoise, it's like they'll be quick out of the gates, but they often will be the quickest to derail too. And I find that people who are a little more modest or even cautious about, oh, I'm not sure if I have, a lot to offer, if I'm ready for leadership, they're the ones that I want to give them a shot and put them in a place that maybe just a notch out of their comfort zone or a little bit ahead of what they're ready for, so that they can show what they've got. Because I find stress and pressure actually brings out what's really inside. And often it's the good stuff that comes out for people who really have it. And it's the less than good stuff that comes out for people who promote themselves, but don't always have the goods to deliver. Thanks for that question though, Tom. That's good.
Yeah.
And guys, thanks for joining us today. I really appreciate this. We're going to do this again, so stick around and join us in future seminars. We're leading up, as we said, to Talent Quest, which we're going to do in March of next year. And so catch our webinars November 30th at this same time on engagement and execution.